Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Let's begin today's show with the China-U.S. trade deal. The two countries are set to sign a Phase 1 trade agreement in Washington next week. The deal was reached in early December after months of sometimes tense negotiations. Take a look.
A trade deal between China and the U.S. is moving closer to completion. China's Ministry of Commerce has confirmed that the two countries will sign their Phase 1 agreement next week.
At the U.S. invitation, Politburo member and Vice Premier Liu He will lead a delegation to visit Washington from 13th to 15th to sign the Phase 1 agreement with the United States. The two teams are in close communication on specific arrangements.
The Phase 1 agreement marks the first stage in resolving the trade dispute between the two countries, which has dragged on for nearly 22 months. The feud was triggered in March 2018 when the U.S. launched what are known as 301 investigations into China's trade practices and the treatment of intellectual property. Washington started slapping tariffs on Chinese goods, and Beijing retaliated in kind. The back and forth escalated into a fully fledged trade war in July last year, with the two countries imposing levies on nearly all categories of each other's exports. Tempers continued to run high throughout 2019, with numerous accusations from the U.S., including calling China a currency manipulator. Some Chinese companies still remain on the U.S. export blacklist, making it almost impossible for them to purchase American-made goods.
America's streak of wrongdoing has tremendously escalated the trade friction. It has not only seriously affected the interests of enterprises and consumers of both countries, but also will cause a recession in the global economy.
Amid all the twists and turns, the two nations held a total of 13 rounds of high-level trade negotiations, with the latest in mid-October. Then in December, Chinese officials announced that Beijing and Washington had reached a consensus on the text of a Phase 1 agreement. Some Chinese experts believe this agreement amounts to a truce declaration. Taking the heat out of the trade dispute will not only benefit the two countries, but also the whole world.
For more on China-U.S. trade deal, we have in Washington Jeff Moon, an international trade and government affairs consultant who's also the former assistant U.S. trade rep for China. In Beijing, we have Li Yong, senior fellow and standing council member of the China Association of International Trade. Welcome to both of you, Mr. Moon and Mr. Li. May I start by asking you if the deal will be signed, Phase 1, next week, as planned. What does it mean for the overall momentum of U.S.-China trade negotiations and discussions when we look at the way forward? Mr. Moon.
We don't know exactly what's in the deal because the negotiations have been secret and the terms have been leaked selectively. But the thrust of what's been leaked so far, from what we know, it appears that basically this Phase 1 deal is all about relieving the pain of the trade war. The U.S. is going to lift some tariffs. The Chinese are going to purchase some food that they needed anyway. There are several other provisions that are mostly recycled promises, like the promise to provide national treatment, and various half measures like the promise, the supposed ban on forced technology transfer, which has many loopholes. So this is a very limited agreement. It really does not address the underlying causes of the problem between the U.S. and China. Our leaders have failed to address those causes, and that lack and failure of leadership has caused us to not be able to cooperate in the ways that we should so that we can truly prosper together. And as a result of that failure, we're going to continue to slide toward decoupling. I hate to be so negative about it, but we really need to get our leaders to focus on what's at issue here.
Well, your leaders is having some problems at home, I'm afraid. Probably it has a lot to do with your own election season, right? So, Mr. Li, also to you, what does that mean? If this deal is signed, Phase 1 is signed next week as scheduled, what could it mean for the future discussions, negotiations, interactions between China and the U.S.?
I think this is going to be kind of a positive move in terms of the both sides' effort to try to strike a deal. In the past over 20 months, I think both sides have experienced a lot of twists, ups and downs, on and off type of negotiation, and finally, I think the two sides have been able to find a kind of a common ground, or the largest denominator, where they can reach the kind of initial agreement. But this is actually is going to serve, I think, as far as the second phase is going to be concerned, as a kind of initial understanding for the both sides to move forward. And of course, if this is going to be signed, I think it is going to be beneficial for the manufacturing, businesses as well as the farmers. But generally, I think it is going to be having some positive impact.
Mr. Moon described it as relieving the pain. How would you describe it, Mr. Li?
The pain is there because the tariff is going to hurt not just Chinese exporters but also the importers in the United States. Recently we read about a research report by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Almost 100% of the tariff burden are kind of taken by the American side, but of course, Chinese exports has also been affected, but it means it doesn't really do good for either side.
Mr. Moon, what's going to happen to the tariffs? Now we are seeing the tariffs are still there to a certain extent. We also know in a global supply chain, when tariffs is inflicted upon one big player on the global supply chain, the other players on the chain would also feel it, and not to mention the close economic and trade ties between China and the United States. So, Mr. Moon, what's going to happen to the tariffs and also the impact on both sides? Mr. Moon.
The tariffs are clearly going to remain in place. This deal does not affect the $350 billion of goods that are still going to be subject to tariffs.
No.
Those tariffs, I think, are not wise, and those tariffs undermine both the business capabilities and business confidence of business people both in China and the U.S. and globally. So this is the problem that remains, and this is part of that failure of leadership that I described before on both the American and on the Chinese sides.
Mr. Li, the U.S. side inflicted tariffs on China first, and then China reacted to that. Now we are seeing both sides are trying to reach certain consensus as a result of phase one. So what's likely to happen to the agriculture sector? Now Chinese side has made it very clear the increased imports of agricultural products coming from the United States, as might be indicated by a phase one deal, is not going to affect the imports of others agricultural products into China. That has already made very clear. And China is going to administer very closely the improvement of the trade in agriculture. So, Mr. Li, what does that mean? And what does that mean also for China to have various diversity of choices, no matter it's in agriculture or in other areas of trade, Mr. Li?
I think agricultural products is an important part of the negotiation, as it has been China's position since the beginning, I think, of the negotiation, that China will import American agricultural products, because it is part of the Chinese demand, because the local production or the Chinese production will not be able to satisfy its demand, particularly the demand for animal feeds. So this is really something that I think China will purchase, and as a matter of fact, China has already started to renew the purchase of soybeans and pork, particularly, and pork import is going to alleviate the current pressure on the pork price.
Yeah. Mr. Moon, to you, it's not going to be about the agricultural process, but I'm interested in the so-called export ban. The U.S. has set, whether it's from different branches of the government against China, whether it's about artificial intelligence technologies, or it's about people or talents interactions, or many other areas. Mr. Moon, what shall we make of this? Is this going to be good atmosphere as we move on to the second phase or other kinds of interactions?
Well, these are the kinds of problems that should have been addressed in the Phase 1 deal and need to be addressed. China's industrial policies, the China 2025 program, and the failure of the Phase 1 deal to address these things. We're going to move, I think this is the high watermark of the negotiations game. China has made it clear it does not want to talk about industrial policies in China 2025. And so we're going to move from a negotiating game to a ground game where the U.S. will start imposing reciprocity on the protectionist Chinese practices that have been in place for a long time. And so we have already seen those mechanisms come into play. We see restrictions on Chinese investment into the United States. We see restrictions on export of American technologies. We see restrictions coming into play, the import of Chinese IT products as well. These are all the kinds of reciprocity, parts of that reciprocity phase that we're going to move into because we have failed to be able to negotiate and resolve things.
Mr. Lee, it's no secret that the U.S. side has been using the word so-called reciprocity to illustrate all the new measures, trade sanctions, as well as bans of certain exports to China to describe its latest actions. But Mr. Lee, of course, the Chinese side disagree, and that's an important part of the negotiation. But Mr. Lee, to that point, how is China looking at the future or the potential of negotiations? And once actions by the U.S. side, for example, banning of artificial intelligence technologies, which the two countries are very much intertwined with one another, mean for the overall global value chain, global innovation chain, and global supply chain? How should China be prepared for that?
I think reciprocity is one of the issues, but I think with the adoption of the new foreign investment law, China, I think, has further opened market access to foreign investment, not just to the American companies. But if we look at the U.S. side, I think the trade war has distorted the kind of level playing field that are supposed to be there in the United States, and even for American companies in the process of a tariff exemption, for example, there's a kind of a discriminatory type of exercise in terms of the companies applying, for the exemption, and in terms of the future cooperation in the AI, in the ICT areas. I think the future is going to be hinging very much on the political consideration, not really on the the industrial supply chain type of situation, and definitely the global supply chain and the supply chain relationship between the two countries will be affected by the the measures that has already been adopted and will be adopted probably in the future.
Well, although we have seen some interesting phenomena, Tesla, for example, has already established its factory in Shanghai, and the very latest model likely to come out with relatively much lower price than it used to be because it's done with a lot of efficiency. Having said that, though, Mr. Moon, there's a lot of uncertainty with your government, whether it's impeachment or the Iran issue already at the very beginning of the year, coupled up with the DPRK nuclear issue, as well as many other crises, together with an election year. So how much can your counterpart, whether it's China or others, trust the commitment made, whether at the executive branch or at the other branches of government by the U.S.?
Well, I think that the fact that there are things going on domestically is not really relevant to the trade issues that we're talking about here, except to the extent that they somehow become linked. I mean, there are lots of domestic issues in China that I'm not going to mention that are also going on.
But you have some problem that is not exactly the same. You have an impeachment against the president by one political party in the House of Representatives going on right now. You have Iran, which in your country already talking about whether there's going to be an imminent war. And you also have very different situation now in DPRK. This is not something you find very relevant in all the other capitals around the world. Mr. Moon, let's just face the reality here. So how much Washington can be trusted now with this Phase 1 deal and also even further discussions with China or the other economies?
Well, okay, let's be frank here. Frankly, Trump is not going to be impeached. The Iran situation has calmed down quite a bit, and yes, it's a busy world out there. There will be other issues out there, but we can walk and chew gum just like China can walk and chew gum. But what your question is really getting to is whether China can trust Donald Trump. That's the real issue here.
That's not the question I'm asking, but if that's your interpretation, go ahead.
Well, no, that's an issue that's of much discussion because he has a very volatile and unpredictable negotiating style. And that's something that I can't tell you how that's going to play out. We will just have to see how that works. I do think that, remaining within this topic, I do think that there will be Phase 2 discussions that will result in nothing, certainly during his first term. Maybe something if he is reelected in a second term, but I think it's very speculative to think that there would be a second term.
I see. Mr. Lee, also about that point, how much will China be able to implement the deal once the deal is signed? That's very important, isn't it? I mean, both sides about the implementation. China also.
I think China has the market in terms of the purchase promises. I think it is there already. I don't really need to say anything more about it. With regard to other things, like the so-called the forced technology transfer. This, it's really difficult to find some examples that can really characterize China as a kind of a forcing foreign technologies. There might be a number of cases, but it's not really a big issue. In terms of intellectual property protection, I think it is also in China's own interest to protect. So it doesn't really. I don't really have any concerns about the China side of the implementation.
We are running out of time, but I'm sure the discussions about this, as always, with two of you and many other scholars from China and U.S. will continue. I want to thank both of you for joining us and providing your insights from your perspectives. Jeff Moon, coming from Washington, D.C., and Li Yong in Beijing. Gentlemen, really appreciate it. Thank you.